The Philadelphia courthouse stood as a monument to American justice, its marble columns gleaming in the pale October sunlight. The morning air carried that crisp autumn chill that made you feel alive, invigorated, ready for anything. But inside the walls of this historic building, tension crackled like electricity through the corridors. Today was the day that would decide everything, the conclusion of a case that had captured the city's attention for months. Judge Patricia Morrison arrived at her chambers before dawn, as she had done for the past 30 years. Her morning ritual was sacred: strong black coffee, 2 slices of wheat toast, and a careful review of the day's proceedings. At 68 years old, with silver streaking through her auburn hair and reading glasses perpetually balanced on her nose, she had seen it all. Murder cases, fraud schemes, custody battles, each one had left its mark on her soul. But this case was different. This was about deception on a massive scale, about trust betrayed, about money that represented people's life savings simply evaporating into thin air. Robert Sullivan had been a pillar of the community. For 23 years, he'd served as the executive vice president of Metropolitan Bank, one of Philadelphia's most prestigious financial institutions. He had a corner office on the 42nd floor with windows overlooking the Schuylkill River. He had a beautiful wife, 2 children attending Ivy League universities, a summer home in the Hamptons, and a reputation that seemed untouchable. But appearances, as Judge Morrison knew well, were often deceiving. The investigation had revealed something sinister lurking beneath Sullivan's polished exterior. Over the course of 7 years, he had systematically stolen $47 million from the bank's accounts through an elaborate scheme of shell companies, fraudulent transfers, and manipulated records. Retired couples had their nest eggs vanished. Small business owners who'd entrusted their operating funds to the bank watched their companies collapse. A widow had lost the insurance settlement meant to support her 3 children. The damage was immeasurable, not just in dollars but in shattered dreams and broken trust. By 8 o'clock, the courthouse corridors began filling with activity. Attorneys in crisp suits rushed between offices, their leather briefcases clicking against the polished marble floors with determined rhythm. Courthouse staff members positioned themselves at security checkpoints, checking IDs and wanding visitors. News reporters gathered outside the building, their camera crews setting up equipment, eager to capture every moment of the trial's final day. This was the story that would lead the evening news, the narrative that would occupy morning show discussions. Prosecutor Sarah Mitchell prepared her final arguments in a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom. She was 45 years old, with a reputation for meticulous preparation and devastating cross-examinations. This case had consumed her for 18 months. She'd worked late nights, studied financial documents until her eyes burned, interviewed witnesses whose voices still echoed in her mind. She believed in justice with the fervor of a crusader, and she was determined that Robert Sullivan would face consequences for his crimes. Defense attorney David Hartwell, meanwhile, was working his own strategy in a different wing of the courthouse. 57 years old, expensive suit, Rolex watch, the kind of lawyer who defended wealthy criminals his entire career. He wasn't interested in truth. He was interested in reasonable doubt, in technicalities, in finding the smallest crack in the prosecution's case that he could exploit. Money was his language, and Sullivan had paid him extremely well to speak it fluently. The courtroom itself was a study in formal dignity. Dark wood paneling covered the walls. The judge's bench stood elevated, commanding authority through its very architecture. The jury box sat to the left, 12 seats that would soon hold the people responsible for determining guilt or innocence. Rows of wooden benches extended behind the bar, separated into sections for press, witnesses, and general spectators. Everything about the space screamed tradition, importance, gravity. At 8:47 a.m., Officer Marcus Chen arrived at the courthouse with his partner, Duke. Chen was a 20-year veteran of the Philadelphia Police Department's K-9 unit. He was a tall man, 6 feet 3 inches, with the bearing of someone who'd spent his life maintaining discipline and control. His dark eyes were intelligent and kind, but they could also turn stern when duty demanded it. He and Duke had been partners for 12 years, an unusually long partnership in the K-9 unit. Most dogs retired after 8 or 9 years, but Duke had proven to be exceptional, driven, intelligent, tireless in his commitment to his work. Duke was an 85-pound German Shepherd with a coat the color of burnished mahogany. His ears stood perpetually alert, rotating to catch every sound. His brown eyes held a brightness that suggested genuine intelligence. He had solved 3 missing person cases, detected contraband in hundreds of scenarios, and tracked dangerous suspects across impossible terrain. He had been shot at, bitten, injured, and had recovered from all of it with the stoicism of a true professional. But more than his achievements, what made Duke special was his intuition, an almost supernatural ability to sense things that humans couldn't perceive. Officer Chen walked Duke through the courthouse security checkpoint with the casual confidence of someone making a routine visit. Duke had been here before, had accompanied other testimony, had waited patiently in designated areas while justice proceeded around him. The security guards waved them through without hesitation. Everyone knew Officer Chen and Duke. They were respected fixtures in the Philadelphia legal system. As they made their way toward the courtroom, Chen felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. Duke's presence was comforting, as it always was. The dog didn't understand the human concept of justice or the complexities of criminal law, but Duke understood loyalty, purpose, and the importance of being present when needed. Chen had always believed that Duke possessed a kind of wisdom that transcended training, an instinctive understanding of human nature that no amount of instruction could provide. The courtroom was already filling with people when Chen and Duke entered. Spectators occupied most of the benches, many of them victims or family members of victims who had been affected by Sullivan's crimes. There was the elderly couple whose retirement savings had vanished, now forced to move in with their daughter at 73 years old. There was the widow, Margaret Chen, no relation to Officer Marcus, sitting with her 3 young children, still recovering from the trauma of discovering that the money meant to sustain them was gone. Judge Morrison entered from chambers at precisely 9:00 a.m., her black robes flowing behind her. The bailiff announced her entrance with the formal words that had been spoken in courtrooms for generations. "All rise," the Honorable Judge Patricia Morrison presiding. Everyone stood immediately, a physical acknowledgement of the authority she represented. As the judge took her seat and glanced across the courtroom, her eyes momentarily landed on Duke. She noted the dog's attentiveness, his calm demeanor, the obvious bond between the animal and his handler. She had always appreciated the presence of K-9 units in her courtroom. Something about their presence reminded her that justice existed in many forms, that truth-seeking transcended human limitations. If only she had known how profoundly true that observation would prove to be on this particular morning. The judge rapped her gavel once, a sound that resonated through the chamber like a heartbeat, and spoke the words that would begin the proceedings. "This court is now in session. Let the record reflect that we are here for the conclusion of the Commonwealth versus Robert Sullivan, case number 2024 CV0847. Counselors, are you ready to proceed?" No one in that courtroom could have predicted what was about to unfold. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the courtroom, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Judge Morrison settled into her chair with the deliberate composure of someone who had presided over countless trials. She adjusted her reading glasses and looked toward the prosecution table where Sarah Mitchell stood, already arranged with her meticulously organized documents, color-coded files, and a laptop displaying her presentation materials. "Prosecutor Mitchell," Judge Morrison said, her voice carrying the weight of authority, "the prosecution may proceed with opening arguments for the final day of this trial. Please remind the jury of the case's critical elements." Sarah Mitchell rose with practiced grace, her navy suit impeccable, her expression conveying both confidence and conviction. She had prepared this moment for months, rehearsing her words until they became second nature, studying the jury members' faces to understand what might resonate with them. She moved toward the jury box, establishing eye contact with each juror individually, a technique that transformed a legal argument into a personal conversation. "Members of the jury," she began, her voice steady and clear, "for the past 3 weeks, we have presented evidence of a systematic, deliberate, and calculated scheme to defraud Metropolitan Bank and its customers of $47 million. This was not a mistake. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a crime executed by a man who violated the trust placed in him by his employers, his colleagues, and the thousands of customers whose life savings he stole." She paused, allowing her words to settle into the jury's consciousness. Robert Sullivan held a position of tremendous responsibility. He sat in boardrooms. He made decisions that affected hundreds of people's financial futures, and he used that position of trust as a weapon against those who believed in him. Mitchell walked slowly along the jury box, her fingers trailing along the wooden railing. "The evidence we have presented includes bank statements showing irregular transactions. It includes testimony from accounting experts who traced millions of dollars flowing through shell companies with addresses that don't exist, with owners who are legally fictitious entities. It includes electronic communications showing Mr. Sullivan deliberately concealing these transactions, altering records, and instructing junior employees to process transfers they weren't authorized to make." She turned to face the jury directly. "But more than documents and testimony, this case is about people, real people whose lives were devastated by this man's greed. People like Margaret Chen, who sits in this courtroom with her 3 young children who lost their father last year. He left them an insurance settlement, a modest amount, but enough to provide stability, enough to ensure they could remain in their home, enough to help them heal. But Mr. Sullivan stole that money. He took food from those children's mouths. He transformed tragedy into catastrophe." In the gallery, Margaret Chen's hands trembled. One of her children, a girl of 8, squeezed her mother's hand tightly. The other jurors couldn't help but notice. Mitchell had planned this carefully, not manipulating emotions but revealing the human cost of Sullivan's actions. "The prosecution trusts that you will examine the evidence with clear eyes and careful deliberation," Mitchell concluded. "The facts speak for themselves. Robert Sullivan is guilty of embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. Thank you." As Mitchell returned to her seat, Judge Morrison turned to the defense table. "Defense counsel, you may present your opening arguments." David Hartwell rose with the confidence of a man who had successfully defended wealthy criminals for decades. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his Rolex gleaming beneath his French cuffs. Unlike Mitchell's emotional appeal, Hartwell's strategy was intellectual obfuscation, creating reasonable doubt through technicality and complexity. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began, his voice smoother than aged whiskey, "the prosecution has presented you with a narrative. But narratives and facts are 2 different things. Yes, there were irregular transactions. Yes, there were shell companies. But the government hasn't proven beyond a reasonable doubt that my client authorized these transactions or understood what was happening in the accounts he nominally oversaw." Hartwell moved to his own position near the jury. Mr. Sullivan worked in a massive corporation with thousands of employees, hundreds of accounts, and millions of transactions daily. Is it not possible that others, perhaps junior employees seeking to embezzle funds themselves, used Mr. Sullivan's position and credentials without his knowledge? Is it not possible that the evidence the prosecution presents is circumstantial, lacking the direct proof necessary for conviction? He paused, letting his questions hang in the air. Furthermore, the prosecution's star witness, Mr. Raymond Torres, Mr. Sullivan's former assistant, has already admitted to embezzling funds himself. Should we really trust his testimony, given that he has every reason to implicate his former supervisor to reduce his own culpability. Hartwell's argument was slick, carefully constructed to introduce doubt without actually proving innocence. It was a masterclass in reasonable doubt manufacturing. The morning proceeded with testimony from witnesses for the prosecution. Raymond Torres, the assistant who had assisted in executing the fraudulent transfers, took the stand. He was nervous, sweating, clearly uncomfortable with his role as both accomplice and informant. But under careful questioning by Mitchell, he provided details about conversations with Sullivan, emails requesting specific transfers, and explicit instructions to hide the transactions. "Did Mr. Sullivan ever tell you directly to execute these fraudulent transfers?" Mitchell asked. "Yes," Torres answered, his voice barely above a whisper. "He called me into his office. He showed me accounts I'd never even heard of. He said, 'Ray, I need you to process these transfers to these accounts. Don't log them in the normal system. Use the backup server.' He knew what he was doing. There's no way he didn't know." When Hartwell cross-examined Torres, he attacked the witness's credibility relentlessly. "Isn't it true that you yourself were embezzling from the bank?" "Yes, but—" "A simple yes or no, Mr. Torres. You were stealing." "Yes, but only small amounts, and Mr. Sullivan—" "Mr. Sullivan what? Made you do it? Coerced you? Or did you simply find the opportunity and take it, just like you're doing now by testifying against him?" Torres' hands clenched. The jury watched this exchange carefully. Hartwell was effective. He didn't prove Torres was lying, but he'd planted seeds of doubt about his credibility. Throughout the morning, Duke remained calm beside Officer Chen. The dog lay with his chin resting on his paws, his ears occasionally perking up at loud voices or sudden sounds. To any observer, Duke appeared to be simply a well-trained animal waiting for his part in the proceedings. But Officer Chen noticed subtle changes in his partner's demeanor as the morning progressed. By mid-morning, testimony from an accounting expert detailed the complex pathways of the fraudulent transfers. Charts and graphs filled the screen, showing arrows connecting accounts, dates aligned with transfer requests, patterns that suggested knowledge and deliberation rather than accident or oversight. Judge Morrison listened intently, occasionally making notes. She had presided over financial crime cases before, and the evidence structure here was stronger than most. Sullivan's defense seemed to rest almost entirely on attacking witness credibility and introducing reasonable doubt, which was technically a valid strategy, but offered little in the way of alternative explanation. As the expert testimony droned on, becoming increasingly technical and numbers-heavy, something shifted in the courtroom atmosphere. The energy that had been present during the emotional opening arguments had begun to dissipate into the fog of financial details and accounting procedures. Jurors were starting to fidget. One elderly juror was fighting to keep his eyes open. It was during this testimony, approximately 11:30 in the morning, that Officer Chen first noticed something unusual about Duke's behavior. The dog's breathing had changed. His muscles, which had been relaxed, began tensing. His eyes, which had been casually scanning the courtroom, suddenly became intensely focused. Chen watched his partner carefully, wondering what had triggered this shift. In 12 years of partnership, he had learned to trust Duke's instincts absolutely. When Duke's behavior changed, it meant something that Chen's human senses might not yet have detected, but which Duke's extraordinary canine perception had already identified. The accounting expert continued his presentation, explaining complex financial instruments and transfer methodologies. The jury struggled to maintain concentration. Judge Morrison's expression remained neutral but attentive. No one else seemed to notice that Duke's entire demeanor had transformed from relaxed to intensely alert. Officer Chen's hand moved to Duke's collar, a gesture of comfort and control. "Easy, boy," he whispered, so quietly that no one else could hear. But Duke's attention remained fixed elsewhere, his focus absolute. his senses honed in on something that existed beyond the realm of human perception. The courtroom continued with its business, unaware that the morning's carefully constructed narrative was about to be disrupted by something no one could have predicted, something that would transform this trial from a case about embezzlement into something far more significant, far more urgent, and far more important. The clock on the courtroom wall ticked toward noon as the accounting expert concluded his presentation. He had been droning on for nearly 2 hours, explaining wire transfers, account reconciliations, and digital forensic evidence that proved Sullivan's knowledge and direct involvement in the fraud scheme. The technical jargon had created a sort of mental fog in the courtroom, the kind of exhaustion that comes from processing numbers and financial terminology for an extended period. Judge Morrison leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression suggesting she was absorbing the information while simultaneously fighting the natural human tendency toward mental fatigue. The jurors showed various signs of concentration difficulty. One woman was shifting uncomfortably in her seat, a man in the third row was blinking heavily, and a younger juror was subtly massaging his temples. It was at this precise moment, when attention was flagging and the courtroom had settled into a kind of monotonous rhythm, that Officer Marcus Chen felt the leash in his hand suddenly tighten. Duke's body, which had been relaxed and loose just moments before, became rigid. Every muscle in the dog's powerful frame contracted simultaneously, as if an electric current had surged through him. Chen's head turned immediately toward his partner. In 12 years, he had never felt Duke respond this way, not even when they'd tracked dangerous fugitives through the woods, not even when they'd worked active crime scenes, not even during the most intense moments of their partnership. This was something different. This was something that transcended standard training responses. Duke's entire body had gone motionless, except for his head, which rotated slowly, deliberately, toward the left side of the courtroom. His brown eyes narrowed with singular focus, pupils dilating until they seemed enormous. His nostrils flared slightly, as if he were drawing in information through scent, processing data that existed at a level of sensory perception humans could barely comprehend. Officer Chen followed his partner's gaze to determine what had captured Duke's attention so completely. His eyes landed on a section of the gallery where a family of 4 sat, a man and woman who appeared to be in their mid-30s, a teenage girl and a small child. The child, a boy who appeared to be approximately 3 years old, sat on his mother's lap. He had blonde curls, pale skin, and features that suggested he might have recently been sick or hadn't been sleeping well. His small frame was curled into his mother's arms, his thumb in his mouth in a manner suggesting comfort-seeking behavior. But Duke's attention wasn't random or casual. The dog's gaze had locked onto that specific child with a laser-like precision that transcended normal canine interest. This wasn't a dog noticing a potential source of food or becoming distracted by movement. This was something far more intense, far more focused, far more urgent. Chen felt his stomach tighten. He had worked with Duke long enough to understand that his partner's reactions served as windows into realities that human senses couldn't access. But what could possibly be so significant about a 3-year-old child sitting quietly in a courtroom? Duke's breathing, which had been normal and rhythmic, began to increase. His chest expanded and contracted more rapidly, becoming almost audible in the otherwise quiet courtroom. The dog's ears, which normally rotated frequently to track various sounds, became fixed in position, pointing directly toward the child. Every ounce of Duke's attention, every cell in his body, every fiber of his being seemed concentrated on maintaining visual and olfactory contact with the young boy. Chen attempted the subtle redirection that worked in most situations. He gently tugged the leash, a small correction that usually prompted Duke to refocus. "Easy, buddy," he whispered, barely audible, the words meant only for his partner's ears. But Duke didn't respond. The dog didn't even acknowledge the correction. His entire consciousness seemed locked onto the child across the courtroom. The accounting expert was still speaking, now discussing specific date correlations and transfer authorizations. His words droned on, but Chen wasn't hearing him anymore. His senses had narrowed to match his partner's focus. Something was happening here, something significant, something that Duke's extraordinary perceptive abilities had detected. Chen noticed other details about the child that he hadn't consciously registered before. The boy's posture was somewhat rigid despite being held by his mother. His face bore an expression of weariness that seemed inappropriate for such a young child. There was a quality of tension in his small frame, a sense of guardedness that shouldn't have existed in a 3-year-old. The child's mother, whose name was Lisa, began to notice Duke's attention. Her body language shifted perceptibly. She straightened slightly, perhaps unconsciously trying to shield her son from the dog's gaze. She turned slightly away from Duke's line of sight, repositioning her son in her arms to create more distance between him and the dog. But distance didn't matter. Duke's focus didn't waver. If anything, the dog's intensity seemed to increase. His breathing had become heavy, not panicked but deliberate, as if he were processing critical information through scent and observation simultaneously. Officer Chen felt heat rising in his chest. He knew Duke's behaviors intimately, had studied his partner's responses through thousands of training sessions and real-world scenarios. He had never encountered anything like this. In Duke's entire history, the dog had never fixed on a civilian in a courtroom setting with this level of intensity. Judge Morrison's eyes moved from the accounting expert to the unusual scene occurring in the gallery. Her decades of judicial experience had attuned her to disturbances in courtroom dynamics, and she immediately sensed that something unexpected was occurring. She paused slightly in her note-taking, her attention dividing between the testimony and the interaction between the K-9 unit and the family. Other spectators were beginning to notice as well. Whispers started in the back of the courtroom, not loud enough to interrupt the proceedings, but audible enough to create a subtle undercurrent of distraction. A reporter sitting in the press section leaned over to her colleague and made a comment. The bailiff noticed and made eye contact with Judge Morrison, a silent question in his expression. Chen tried a more direct command, still keeping his voice low. "Duke, focus," he said, using the dog's standard redirect signal. But even this command, which Duke had obeyed thousands of times, seemed to have no effect. The dog remained utterly fixated on the child. Lisa, Tommy's mother, was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. She shifted in her seat, her face reddening slightly with embarrassment at drawing attention. She whispered something to her husband, the man sitting beside her, who appeared to shrug with mild annoyance. The teenage girl who had been sitting between them, their daughter, asked her mother, "What's wrong with the dog?" "Nothing, sweetie, the dog just—" "I don't know," Lisa whispered back, clearly unsettled by the situation. But something was very wrong, at least, that was what Duke's every instinct seemed to be communicating. The dog's muscles trembled slightly with tension. His ears rotated back and forth, catching every sound. His pupils remained massively dilated, his eyes unblinking as he maintained his focus on the child. Officer Chen felt a chill run down his spine. In his 20 years with the police department and his 12 years partnered with Duke specifically, he had learned one immutable truth. When Duke reacted this way, when he demonstrated this level of focused intensity, it was because he had detected something. The dog didn't act without cause. Duke's instincts had never been wrong. But what could he possibly be detecting? What did his extraordinary senses perceive about a 3-year-old boy that warranted this response? The accounting expert continued his testimony, unaware that the courtroom's attention was beginning to fragment. Judge Morrison watched the situation carefully, her judicial instincts firing on all cylinders, sensing that something significant was unfolding before her. Something that transcended the trial she was presiding over, something that might be far more important than questions of embezzlement and fraud. The stare continued, unwavering and intensifying. Duke didn't blink. He didn't move. He simply maintained absolute visual contact with the child while his breathing grew heavier and his body language transmitted urgency that only those who knew him intimately could understand. Officer Chen's grip on the leash tightened unconsciously. His mind raced with possibilities and questions. Whatever this was, whatever Duke had detected, it was something that demanded attention, urgent, immediate, undeniable attention. And somewhere in the back of his consciousness, Chen began to understand that this moment, this unexpected, unprecedented moment, was about to change everything about how this trial unfolded. The tension in the courtroom had shifted from judicial formality to something far more primal, far more urgent. What had begun as a subtle disturbance now rippled through the gallery like an invisible wave, unsettling observers and drawing everyone's attention away from the testimony being presented at the front of the room. The accounting expert, Mr. David Tanner, had paused mid-sentence, his professional composure slightly rattled by the disruption occurring behind him. Duke's stare remained absolutely fixed on young Tommy Chen. Not a single muscle in the dog's body moved except for the steady expansion and contraction of his chest as his breathing intensified. His eyes, locked on the child with an intensity that bordered on supernatural, didn't blink, didn't waver, didn't acknowledge anything else in the courtroom. Not the judge, not the jury, not the attorneys, not even his handler's attempts at redirection. Officer Marcus Chen made another attempt at controlling his partner, pulling slightly on the leash with a bit more force than before. "Duke, down," he commanded, using the command that typically brought Duke to a lying position. But the dog ignored the instruction entirely. It was as if Chen's voice couldn't penetrate whatever state Duke had entered, a state of heightened awareness that seemed to operate on a plane beyond normal training responses. Chen felt his heart rate accelerating. Sweat began forming on his palms, making the leash feel slightly slippery. In his mind, he was running through possibilities, analyzing his partner's behavior through the lens of their 12-year partnership. Duke didn't act without reason. Duke's instincts were more reliable than most human judgments. But this was something unprecedented in their working relationship. Lisa, Tommy's mother, was becoming visibly distressed. Her initial embarrassment had transformed into something more acute, a genuine anxiety that manifested in the tightening of her arms around her son. Tommy, sensing his mother's discomfort, began to shift in her lap, his small body pressing harder against hers, as if seeking protection from the dog's unwavering attention. "Mommy, why is the doggy looking at me?" Tommy asked, his young voice carrying a note of confusion and the beginning of fear. "It's okay, sweetie," Lisa whispered back, but her voice wavered slightly, betraying her own uncertainty. She turned her body further away from Duke's line of sight, creating a physical barrier between her son and the dog. But the gesture felt inadequate, almost futile, because Duke's perceptual abilities seemed to operate beyond the limitations of physical obstruction. Lisa's husband, whose name was Gregory, placed a hand on his wife's shoulder. "Just ignore it," he said tersely, his voice carrying an edge that suggested irritation rather than comfort. But ignoring the situation had become impossible. The entire right side of the courtroom was now aware that something unusual was occurring. Judge Morrison set down her pen deliberately. A gesture that signaled her full attention was now diverted from the testimony. Her sharp eyes, honed by decades of observing human behavior in the context of judicial proceedings, analyzed the situation with practiced precision. She had presided over thousands of trials, had witnessed countless unexpected moments, but she recognized instinctively that this particular moment carried significance beyond the ordinary. The bailiff, a tall man named Deputy Williams who had worked in the courthouse for 15 years, shifted his position slightly, unconsciously preparing to intervene if the situation escalated. His hand moved closer to his belt, a habitual response to any disturbance, even though the dog posed no apparent physical threat. Prosecutor Sarah Mitchell glanced backward, her concentration on the testimony momentarily broken. She observed the interaction between Duke and the family with the analytical mind of someone trained to identify patterns and inconsistencies. Her prosecutorial instincts, honed through years of trial work, began processing the scene with heightened awareness. David Hartwell, the defense attorney, had also paused in his note-taking. His eyes moved from the accounting expert to the source of the disturbance. He was less concerned with the meaning of what was occurring than with whether it might impact the jury's attention and focus on the testimony he was being paid to challenge. The accounting expert, Mr. Tanner, had now completely stopped speaking. He stood at the presentation podium, chart pointer still in his hand, clearly uncertain whether to continue or wait for the courtroom to settle. He looked toward Judge Morrison for guidance, his professional demeanor slightly ruffled by the interruption. Duke's breathing had become almost audible now, heavy, deliberate, and intense. The dog's entire musculature was engaged, trembling slightly with the effort of maintaining his focused state. His ears remained locked in position, directed toward Tommy, but his sensory apparatus seemed to be collecting information far beyond what his ears could capture. He was processing the child through multiple channels of perception simultaneously: visual, olfactory, and perhaps something even more subtle that existed beyond human understanding. Officer Chen made a decision. He stood up from his seat, still maintaining control of Duke's leash, and began moving toward the back of the courtroom. His intention was to remove his partner from the gallery, to create distance and hopefully break whatever spell had captured Duke's attention. But as he stood, Duke stood with him, the dog's body immediately transitioning from sitting to standing position without losing any focus on the child. The movement created additional disruption. More spectators turned to watch. The teenage girl in the family, whose name was Sarah and who was 14 years old, leaned toward her mother. "Mom, what's going on?" Lisa didn't answer, her attention consumed by the dog that continued to stare at her youngest son with an intensity that was becoming increasingly unsettling. She could feel the weight of others' gazes turning toward her family now, could sense the collective focus shifting from the trial's formal proceedings to whatever was unfolding in the gallery. As Officer Chen attempted to move toward the back of the courtroom with Duke, the dog suddenly planted his feet. He didn't pull forward, he didn't become aggressive. He simply refused to move, his body language clearly indicating that he was not going anywhere. He was not leaving the gallery. He was not breaking his focus on Tommy Chen. Chen felt his frustration mounting, mixed with a deeper concern that he couldn't quite articulate. In 12 years, Duke had never refused a direct command or resisted his handler's physical guidance. The dog's behavior was becoming increasingly incomprehensible, yet simultaneously, some instinctive part of Chen was beginning to understand that his partner was communicating something of critical importance. Judge Morrison leaned forward on her bench, her judicial authority extending toward the situation. "Officer Chen," she said, her voice cutting through the courtroom's nervous energy, "what is the nature of this disturbance?" Chen turned toward the judge, clearly troubled. "Your Honor, I'm not certain. Duke is. He's not responding to commands. This behavior is extremely unusual for him." "I can see that," Morrison replied, her eyes moving from Chen to Duke to the family in the gallery. "Can you explain why your dog is so intensely focused on that child?" It was a question Chen couldn't answer. He shook his head slightly. "I honestly don't know, Your Honor. In 12 years of partnership, I've never seen him act this way." Lisa was now openly anxious, her arms pulled tightly around Tommy. "Can we leave? Can we please just leave?" she asked the bailiff, her voice betraying genuine distress. But Judge Morrison raised a hand. "Deputy, please ask the family to remain. Officer Chen, bring your dog here." The judge's command carried absolute authority. Chen didn't hesitate. He pulled the leash more firmly, and this time Duke responded, though not to return to sitting passively. Instead, the dog moved forward, directly toward the family's seats in the gallery, still maintaining his intense focus on Tommy. As Duke moved closer, his behavioral intensity seemed to increase exponentially. His nostrils continued to work, drawing in the scent of the child. His eyes remained absolutely locked on Tommy's face, and his breathing had become so heavy that observers could hear each breath, an audible indication of the dog's heightened emotional and sensory state. Tommy began to cry, sensing the dog's approach and reacting to his mother's anxiety. "Mommy, I'm scared," he whimpered, his young voice filled with genuine fear. Lisa held her son protectively, her own anxiety now mixed with defensiveness. "Please keep that dog away from my son," she said loudly, her voice resonating through the courtroom. But Duke continued to move forward, his focus unwavering. Officer Chen allowed him to approach, his professional instincts telling him that something significant was being communicated here, something that transcended normal behavior, something that demanded to be witnessed and understood. The courtroom had descended into controlled chaos. The accounting expert had completely stopped his testimony. The jury members were craning their necks, trying to understand what was happening. Reporters were scribbling notes furiously. Camera flashes would have erupted if photography had been permitted in the courtroom. Judge Morrison observed all of this with her sharp judicial eye, her years of experience and instinct colliding with the unprecedented nature of what was unfolding before her. She could sense, though she couldn't yet understand, that this moment, this bizarre, incomprehensible moment, held significance that transcended the trial's original purpose. Duke remained absolutely focused on Tommy Chen, his entire being communicating an urgency that only those trained in animal behavior might begin to comprehend. And in that moment, as the courtroom descended into confusion and alarm, Judge Morrison made an intuitive leap that would change everything about how the rest of this day would unfold. The courtroom had reached a critical juncture, that tipping point where formal judicial proceedings were transforming into something far more urgent and unpredictable. Judge Patricia Morrison sat elevated on her bench, her sharp eyes absorbing every detail of the unfolding scene, with the intensity of someone who understood that extraordinary moments require extraordinary responses. Her 30 years of judicial experience had taught her to recognize when protocol needed to yield to something more fundamental, human intuition, and the wisdom that sometimes emerged from unexpected sources. Duke continued his unwavering focus on Tommy Chen, the dog's entire physical presence communicating something beyond normal canine behavior. The intensity was palpable, almost suffocating in its weight. Officer Chen stood with his hand on Duke's collar, equally puzzled and deeply concerned by his partner's inexplicable actions. Judge Morrison observed the scene with meticulous attention. She noticed how Duke's pupils remained massively dilated, how his breathing had become labored and deliberate, how every muscle in his powerful frame seemed engaged in some form of intense communication. She also noticed the family's response, the mother's defensive posture, the child's growing fear, the father's visible irritation mixed with something that looked almost like anxiety. In that moment, something shifted in Morrison's consciousness. 30 years on the bench had taught her to trust instincts that transcended logical explanation. She had witnessed human behavior in its most extreme forms, people lying, people revealing hidden truths, people revealing aspects of themselves they normally kept concealed. But she had never witnessed an animal communicate with such absolute clarity and focused intensity. Morrison leaned forward on her bench, her hands folded before her. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the unmistakable weight of judicial authority, but also something else, a tone that suggested she was listening to something beyond the courtroom's immediate circumstances. "Officer Chen," she said, her words cutting through the nervous energy that filled the space, "approach the bench. Bring your dog with you, now." The command was absolute and brooked no argument. Chen immediately moved forward, Duke moving alongside him, though the dog's attention remained partially fixed on Tommy even as he complied with his handler's direction. The family watched with a mixture of confusion and profound anxiety as the German shepherd and his handler approached the judge's elevated position. Judge Morrison looked down at Duke with an expression that was difficult to categorize. It seemed to combine judicial authority with something almost philosophical, a recognition that she was witnessing something that transcended the ordinary boundaries of courtroom protocol. "Officer Chen," Morrison began, her voice steady and deliberate, "in my 30 years as a judge, I have learned something that most people never understand. Rules are important. Procedures are necessary. But sometimes human wisdom, or perhaps I should say, the wisdom communicated through all sentient beings, demands that we transcend those rules and procedures." She paused, allowing her statement to resonate through the courtroom. Every observer was listening intently now, the trial's original purpose completely forgotten. "This dog," Morrison continued, gesturing slightly toward Duke, "is communicating something with extraordinary clarity. I don't know what it is. I don't claim to understand animal behavior at a scientific level, but I have spent 3 decades studying human behavior, studying truth and deception, studying the ways that people attempt to conceal reality." Morrison's eyes moved from Duke to Officer Chen. "In my experience, when something this unusual occurs, when an animal demonstrates this level of focused intensity without apparent training motivation, it is invariably communicating something of critical importance. It is my judicial judgment that we should listen." She raised her hand, her voice taking on the formal cadence of judicial pronouncement. "I am declaring a temporary recess in these proceedings, not because of standard legal procedure, but because my instincts, honed through 3 decades of judicial service, are telling me that something significant is occurring in this courtroom that demands immediate attention and investigation." The courtroom erupted in whispers and confused murmurs. Prosecutor Mitchell's eyes widened. Defense Attorney Hartwell stood up abruptly, his professional composure cracking slightly. "Your Honor, I must object. This is highly irregular. We're in the middle of testimony that directly impacts the defendant's culpability. Stopping proceedings for a dog's behavior is—" "Counselor," Morrison interrupted, her voice carrying a sharpness that made it clear she would tolerate no argument, "I am aware of how irregular this is. I am aware that in my 30 years I have never taken such action, but I am also aware that my judicial responsibility transcends the protocols and procedures we normally follow. Sometimes doing justice requires stepping beyond those boundaries." She looked directly at Hartwell. "You will have the opportunity to object to this decision and raise it in appeals if you choose to do so. But right now, in this moment, I am exercising my judicial authority to declare a recess." Morrison then turned her attention to the bailiff. "Deputy Williams, please ensure that this family," she gestured toward Lisa, Gregory, and Tommy, "remains available. They will not be leaving the courthouse until we have completed our investigation of this matter." Lisa's face went pale. Gregory stood up abruptly. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we haven't done anything wrong. Why should we be detained?" "You're not being detained," Morrison replied, her tone firm but not unkind. "You're being asked to remain available for questioning. There's a significant difference. Deputy Williams will ensure your comfort and privacy. You will have access to water, bathroom facilities, and we will attempt to minimize disruption to your family." She then addressed the entire courtroom. "This recess is effective immediately. All court personnel and observers should remain within the courthouse until further notice. The jury will be sequestered in the jury room. Counselors, you will remain available for consultation." As Morrison struck her gavel once, the sound echoed through the courtroom with finality. The formal proceeding that had been so carefully structured and controlled had been interrupted by something that transcended protocol and procedure. Officer Chen stood beside Judge Morrison. Duke now sitting calmly, but with his attention still partially directed toward where Tommy sat with his increasingly distressed family. Chen looked genuinely bewildered by the turn of events. "Officer Chen," Morrison said, her voice now slightly softer, carrying a tone that suggested she was speaking to him as a colleague rather than a subordinate. "I need you to work with my court social worker. I'm having her brought up immediately. I need to understand what your dog is communicating. I don't pretend to know animal behavior at a sophisticated level, but I do know that this level of focused response is unusual. Tell me about your dog's training. Tell me about his history. Tell me about what might trigger this response." Chen nodded, still visibly processing what had just occurred. "Yes, Your Honor, I don't fully understand this myself, but Duke has excellent instincts. He's detected countless things that humans missed. In 12 years, he's never been wrong about something this intense." "Then we should listen to him," Morrison said simply. "We should listen to what he's trying to communicate." She turned toward the family area where Lisa sat holding Tommy, her son now crying from the stress and confusion. "Deputy Williams, please escort that family to the private consultation room. Ensure they have water, and please request the court social worker to join them. Someone needs to understand what's happening here, and it seems that Officer Chen's dog has decided it's important enough to interrupt a murder trial." The recess that Morrison had declared was spreading through the courthouse like an electrical shock. Within minutes, people were mobilizing. The court social worker was being called up to the courthouse. Deputy Williams was escorting the increasingly bewildered family away from the gallery and toward the private consultation room. Reporters outside the courthouse were receiving reports of the unprecedented interruption and were scrambling to understand what had caused a judge to halt proceedings. Judge Morrison remained on her bench, her hands folded, her expression contemplative. She had just made one of the most unusual decisions of her judicial career. She had halted a major trial because a dog was staring at a child. By all rational procedural standards, she had acted improperly. But her instincts, those same instincts that had served her well for 30 years, were telling her that justice sometimes wore unexpected faces and communicated through surprising channels. Duke, having achieved his immediate objective of drawing attention to Tommy, seemed to relax slightly. But his eyes still tracked the child as the family was led away from the courtroom, his body language continuing to suggest that he had detected something of critical importance, something that demanded investigation and understanding. In that moment, the embezzlement trial, the $47 million in stolen funds, Robert Sullivan's guilt or innocence, all of it had become secondary to a far more pressing question. What had Duke detected about a 3-year-old boy that was so significant that it warranted interrupting formal judicial proceedings? And more importantly, what would the investigation that was about to commence reveal? The private consultation room located on the 3rd floor of the Philadelphia courthouse was designed for sensitive conversations, cases involving child custody disputes, domestic violence situations, and other matters requiring privacy and discretion. It was a modest space with soft lighting, comfortable furniture, and an atmosphere intentionally calming. But the tension that filled the room as Lisa, Gregory, and their children sat waiting was anything but calm. Lisa held Tommy protectively on her lap, the child's sobs having subsided into quiet whimpers. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed his blonde curls, her maternal instincts in overdrive, trying to understand what had precipitated this extraordinary turn of events. Gregory sat beside her, his jaw clenched, his foot tapping repeatedly against the floor, a nervous habit that betrayed his underlying anxiety despite his attempts at outward composure. Sarah, their 14-year-old daughter, sat on a separate chair, her young face confused and worried. She had witnessed enough in her 14 years to understand that something significant was occurring, but she couldn't fathom what it might be or why her family had been singled out for this unusual attention. The door opened, and a woman entered whose presence immediately created a shift in the room's atmosphere. Her name was Dr. Elena Vasquez, and she had served as the courthouse social worker for 7 years. She was in her early 50s, with warm brown eyes that conveyed both professional competence and genuine human compassion. She carried a folder and a notepad, but her demeanor suggested she was approaching this interaction as a conversation between humans rather than an interrogation. "Good afternoon," Dr. Vasquez said, her voice gentle and non-threatening. "I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez, the court social worker. I'm here because Judge Morrison has asked me to have a conversation with you about what happened in the courtroom. This isn't an investigation in a criminal sense. We're simply trying to understand what that dog was responding to." Lisa's face, which had been tight with anxiety, seemed to tighten further. "We haven't done anything wrong," she said defensively, her protective instinct toward her family overriding her desire to cooperate. "Tommy is our son. We love him. I don't understand why that dog why it was staring at him." Dr. Vasquez sat down slowly, maintaining a posture that was open and non-threatening. "I'm not here to accuse anyone of anything. A police dog displayed extraordinary behavior focused on your son. Judge Morrison asked me to understand why. That's all this is about." She paused, allowing her words to settle. "Can you tell me a little about Tommy? How has he been? Has anything unusual happened recently? Any changes in his behavior, his sleep patterns, his emotional state?" Gregory shifted uncomfortably. "He's been fine. He's 3 years old. 3-year-olds have their ups and downs, but he's generally a happy kid." But Dr. Vasquez's trained eye had already noticed things that Gregory's defensive comment didn't address. She observed Tommy's posture, the way he was curled tightly against his mother, the tension in his small shoulders, the weariness in his expression that seemed inappropriate for a 3-year-old. She noticed the faint bruising around his left elbow, barely visible but present. She noticed how his eyes tracked nervously toward Gregory whenever his father moved. "Tommy seems somewhat anxious," Dr. Vasquez observed gently. "Has he been experiencing anxiety?" Lisa hesitated, and in that hesitation, Dr. Vasquez recognized the moment when truth began to crack through the surface of protective denial. He's been having trouble sleeping," Lisa said quietly, "and he gets scared sometimes. We thought maybe it was just growing up, but—" She trailed off, and Gregory made a subtle gesture, not obvious enough to be threatening, but clear enough that Dr. Vasquez, trained to recognize the subtle dynamics of family dysfunction, understood that this was a moment where Lisa was being encouraged not to elaborate. "Lisa," Dr. Vasquez said, her voice taking on a slightly different quality, still gentle but with more directness, "I need you to understand something. What that dog did in the courtroom today wasn't random. Police dogs are trained to detect many things: drugs, explosives, human remains. But some dogs also have an extraordinary ability to detect stress, trauma, and fear in human beings. They can perceive things through scent and body language that humans might miss." She let those words hang in the air. "I'm wondering if something has happened to Tommy, something that might have caused him stress or fear." The room went absolutely silent. Lisa's arms tightened around Tommy protectively. Gregory's foot stopped tapping. Sarah looked up, her young eyes suddenly alert with concern. "Nothing has happened to him," Gregory said firmly, his voice carrying a note of finality that suggested he believed the conversation should end there. But Dr. Vasquez had been trained to recognize denial and protective mechanisms. She had worked with dozens of families where abuse or trauma existed beneath the surface of normalcy. She recognized the pattern. "I'm going to be very direct," Dr. Vasquez said, her voice remaining kind but carrying an edge of professional authority. "Judge Morrison didn't stop a major trial on a whim. That dog was communicating something. And Tommy's physical presentation suggests that something has happened to cause him stress. I'm asking you, as a social worker and as someone who has dedicated her career to protecting children, to tell me what's going on." Lisa's face crumpled. Her eyes filled with tears that began streaming down her cheeks. Tommy, sensing his mother's emotional shift, began crying again, his small body pressed against hers. "It's not. Tommy hasn't been abused," Lisa said, her words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "But there's a man, Marcus. He's been staying with us for about 8 months. He's my boyfriend and—" She paused, gathering courage. "He's been rough with Tommy, not in a way that leaves marks most of the time. He yells. He gets angry over small things. He's told Tommy he's stupid, that he's worthless, that nobody would want him. And sometimes he grabs him too hard when he's angry. There's been touching that isn't appropriate." The words hung in the air like a contamination spreading through the room. Gregory's face had gone pale. Sarah's eyes widened in shock and hurt. "You told me you broke up with him," Gregory said, his voice strained. "You said you ended it." "I tried to," Lisa whispered, "but he kept coming back. And I was so afraid that if I reported it, if I did anything official, I would lose Tommy. I thought as long as I was there, as long as I was watching, he would be okay. I was going to leave him, Marcus. I was going to." Dr. Vasquez's expression had hardened into something professionally serious. She immediately stood up and excused herself, stepping out of the consultation room and moving swiftly toward Judge Morrison's chambers. Within minutes, additional personnel were mobilized. Child Protective Services was being contacted. Law enforcement was being notified, and the preliminary investigation that the dog had inadvertently initiated was expanding into something far more serious and comprehensive. Back in the consultation room, Lisa held her son while tears streamed down her face. Sarah moved to sit beside her mother, her young face processing the revelation that her family had been harboring a threat she hadn't fully understood. The 3-year-old, still too young to comprehend the complexity of what was occurring, simply clung to his mother, seeking the comfort that only a parent could provide. Officer Chen, meanwhile, was being updated on the situation by Judge Morrison. The judge sat in her chambers, her expression grave and her understanding complete. "Your dog detected trauma and threat," Morrison said to Chen. "He detected stress hormones and fear in that child. He communicated something that humans, operating within normal social boundaries, might have missed. He protected a vulnerable person who couldn't protect himself." Chen nodded, his hand moving to stroke Duke's head as the dog sat calmly beside him. "He's done this before," Chen said quietly. "Not with children, but he's always been able to detect when something was wrong, when someone was in danger or distressed. It's like he has a sense for human suffering." "Then your dog is remarkable," Morrison said, "and that family should be grateful that he was in that courtroom today." Within the hour, Child Protective Services had initiated an investigation. Marcus, Lisa's boyfriend, was located and arrested on suspicion of child abuse. A preliminary medical examination of Tommy revealed a history of minor injuries consistent with rough handling and psychological trauma indicators consistent with emotional abuse and inappropriate contact. The case that would unfold would be complex and heartbreaking, but one thing was certain. The 3-year-old boy would receive protection and support that might otherwise have never materialized. And somewhere in the courthouse, a German shepherd named Duke had returned to his quiet vigil beside his handler, having accomplished something far more significant than any crime detection he had performed in his distinguished career. He had protected an innocent child through the most fundamental communication available to him, unwavering focus on the presence of human suffering. The Philadelphia Department of Human Services moved with impressive urgency once Dr. Vasquez filed her report. By 3:47 p.m., a caseworker named James Morrison, no relation to Judge Morrison, arrived at the courthouse with another social worker named Patricia Chen, also no relation to Officer Chen. They carried the weight of their profession, years of experience dealing with child abuse cases, domestic violence situations, and family trauma that existed beneath the surface of ordinary life. James Morrison was a tall man in his early 40s with salt and pepper hair and eyes that had witnessed too much human suffering, but retained their capacity for compassion. Patricia Chen was younger, in her early 30s, with an intensity of purpose that suggested she had entered social work specifically to protect vulnerable children from harm. They met with Dr. Vasquez in a private office to review the initial findings. The information was deeply troubling. Tommy Chen, age 3, had displayed behavioral patterns consistent with child abuse, emotional trauma, anxiety, sleep disturbances, and signs of physical abuse, including old bruising in various states of healing. Lisa Chen had admitted to months of neglect in protecting her son from her boyfriend Marcus's increasingly aggressive behavior. The situation represented a clear and present danger to the child's welfare. "We need to act quickly," James Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made thousands of such decisions. "The child needs to be removed from the home immediately for his safety. The mother is complicit through negligence, whether intentional or not. We'll need to establish emergency protective custody." Patricia Chen nodded, her tablet already displaying forms and procedures. "I'll contact the emergency removal team. We can have temporary placement arranged within the hour. The child will go into emergency foster care pending the full investigation and any legal proceedings." The machinery of child protection, once activated, moved with determination. Social services personnel began contacting potential emergency foster homes. Background checks were run rapidly. A foster family was identified, a couple named Robert and Margaret Williams who had been licensed foster parents for 8 years and had experience with traumatized young children. Meanwhile, law enforcement was conducting their own investigation. Police units were dispatched to locate Marcus, Lisa's boyfriend. They found him at an apartment 3 blocks from where the family lived. The arrest was straightforward. He was taken into custody without resistance, his expression shifting from confusion to anger to the realization that his actions had been discovered. Back at the courthouse, Lisa sat in a small interview room with both social services representatives. The conversation was emotionally devastating for her. She was facing the immediate loss of custody of her son, the revelation that her maternal instincts had failed to protect him adequately, and the terrible knowledge that her own romantic choices had endangered the person she loved most. "I didn't know," she said repeatedly, her words becoming almost a mantra. "I didn't know how bad it was. I thought as long as I was there, as long as I was watching, he would be safe." "But you knew something was wrong," Patricia Chen said gently but firmly. "You knew Tommy was being rough-handled. You knew Marcus was being psychologically cruel, and you didn't take action. That's what we're struggling with here." Lisa's face crumpled. "I was scared. I was scared that if I reported it, if I did anything official, they would take Tommy away from me. I thought I was protecting him by staying, by being there, by hoping it would get better." "Instead," James Morrison said, his voice not unkind but absolutely clear, "you enabled an abusive situation to continue. A child is always the victim in these circumstances, and your fear of losing him was less important than his immediate safety." The words were harsh, but they were also true. Lisa understood the logic even as her heart was breaking at the implications. By 5:30 p.m., Tommy had been placed in the protective custody of Robert and Margaret Williams. The transition was handled with as much gentleness as possible, though no amount of gentleness could eliminate the trauma of a 3-year-old being separated from his mother. Tommy cried, reached for Lisa, called her name as Margaret Williams gently led him away. Lisa watched through tears, her own sobs echoing through the courthouse hallway, the weight of her failures pressing down on her with physical force. Sarah, Tommy's 14-year-old sister, remained in the custody of her father Gregory, though she was now being counseled by court-appointed therapists to process the revelation that her family had been harboring abuse and that her younger brother had been suffering in ways she hadn't fully understood. Officer Chen and Duke observed much of this from a respectful distance. Chen had been given a thorough debriefing about Duke's behavior and the outcome that had resulted from the dog's extraordinary perception. Judge Morrison had personally thanked him, acknowledging that Duke had accomplished something remarkable. "Your dog did what law enforcement, medical professionals, and family members failed to do," Morrison had said. He perceived suffering that existed beneath the surface of normal social interaction. He communicated that suffering in the only way available to him. And because you trusted your dog enough to bring him to court that day, a child was protected. Chen had been deeply moved by the judge's words. He had always trusted Duke's instincts, but this was the first time those instincts had led to such profound human consequences. The dog had literally saved a child's life, not from immediate physical danger, but from ongoing abuse that likely would have escalated and caused severe trauma. The embezzlement trial that had been interrupted by Duke's behavior was now in an awkward position. Judge Morrison called a conference with both attorneys in her chambers to discuss how to proceed. "Gentlemen," Morrison said, "we have an unprecedented situation. A trial that was well underway has been interrupted due to extraordinary circumstances. I'm aware that this interruption has created legal complications, and I understand that both of you may wish to raise procedural objections." David Hartwell, the defense attorney, leaned forward. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this interruption has prejudiced my client. The jury has been in recess for hours. The momentum of the testimony has been disrupted. A mistrial may be the appropriate remedy." "Or," Sarah Mitchell countered, "we could simply resume proceedings. The evidence is clear. The testimony is on the record. The jury can focus on the facts presented." Morrison raised her hand. "Here's what I'm going to do. We will resume proceedings tomorrow morning. The jury will be brought in and given clear instructions that the recess was a necessary judicial action unrelated to the merits of the case. We will allow the accounting expert to complete his testimony. The trial will proceed to completion, and if Mr. Hartwell wishes to appeal on procedural grounds afterward, he has every right to do so." She paused, her expression serious. "But I want both of you to understand something. A 3-year-old child was protected today because I made the decision to listen to something beyond the normal parameters of judicial procedure. If that child had not been removed from his abusive situation, the consequences could have been catastrophic. The trial of Robert Sullivan will continue. Justice will be pursued on that front. But the greater justice that occurred today, the protection of an innocent child, that was more important than any embezzlement case." Hartwell had no response. Even he, cynical as he was, understood the magnitude of what had occurred. That evening, Margaret and Robert Williams brought Tommy to their home. It was a modest house with a backyard, a children's room with toys and books, and an atmosphere intentionally designed to feel safe and welcoming to traumatized children. Tommy cried for his mother that night, his small body shaking with sobs as Margaret held him, whispering that he was safe now, that no one would hurt him anymore. The preliminary medical examination had revealed multiple areas of concern. Tommy displayed signs of minor fractures consistent with rough handling. He had small bruises in various stages of healing. Psychologically, he showed clear indicators of trauma, anxiety, and emotional abuse. But he also showed something that the medical professionals noted with cautious optimism: resilience. The 3-year-old boy had an inner strength that suggested he might, with proper care and therapy, recover from what had been done to him. Meanwhile, Marcus was being processed through the criminal justice system. Charges were filed: child abuse, assault on a minor, and inappropriate sexual contact with a child. His bail was denied due to the severity of the charges and his perceived danger to the victim. Lisa, devastated and broken by what had occurred, entered into mandatory counseling. She would need to complete domestic violence education programs, parenting classes, and mental health treatment before she could ever hope to regain custody of her son. She would also need to demonstrate that she had removed all threatening elements from her life, and that she had developed the strength and judgment necessary to protect a vulnerable child. Judge Morrison, sitting in her chambers that evening, reflected on the extraordinary day. She had been on the bench for 30 years and had made thousands of decisions, but few of them had the profound human impact of the one she'd made that day. She had trusted an animal's instinct over judicial protocol. She had halted a major trial based on intuition, and that decision had resulted in a child being protected from ongoing abuse. As she prepared to leave the courthouse, she passed by the holding area where Officer Chen and Duke were completing their paperwork for the day. She paused and placed her hand on Duke's head. "Good boy," she said simply. "You did something truly remarkable today." Duke's tail wagged slightly, the dog seemingly understanding that he had done something significant, even if he couldn't comprehend the full scope of his impact. The months following that extraordinary day in October unfolded with the slow, methodical pace of healing and justice that characterizes legal and therapeutic intervention. The embezzlement trial concluded with a guilty verdict for Robert Sullivan. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, a sentence that reflected the severity of his crimes and the number of victims he had harmed. But strangely, the trial that had been interrupted by Duke's extraordinary behavior seemed almost secondary to what had truly mattered that day. Tommy Chen's journey toward healing began immediately upon his placement with Robert and Margaret Williams. The foster parents were experienced in working with traumatized children, understanding that recovery from abuse required patience, consistency, and unconditional support. They established routines that provided structure and safety: regular meal times, bedtimes with gentle rituals, playtime with age-appropriate toys, and constant reassurance that he was loved and protected. The first month was the most difficult. Tommy experienced nightmares that would wake him crying, calling for his mother even though his conscious mind understood that he wasn't safe with her. He had regressive behaviors: thumb-sucking, difficulty with toilet training, clinginess that meant he needed to know Margaret's location at all times. He flinched at sudden movements and loud voices, his nervous system still in survival mode, still processing the threat that had been his reality. But Margaret Williams was patient. She held Tommy through his nightmares. She sang to him softly when he was anxious. She demonstrated through consistent action that the world could be safe, that adults could be trustworthy, that love didn't have to come with pain or fear. Robert Williams taught Tommy simple things: how to throw a ball, how to help water the garden, how to feel pride in small accomplishments. A court-appointed psychologist, Dr. Michael Torres, began seeing Tommy twice weekly. The sessions with a 3-year-old were necessarily different from traditional therapy. They involved play, drawing, and observation rather than verbal processing. But Tommy began to reveal his trauma through his play. He acted out scenarios with dolls that depicted yelling, hitting, and fear. Gradually, with Dr. Torres' gentle guidance, Tommy began to act out scenarios where the threatening figure was removed, where safety was restored, where the child figure was comforted and protected. By month 3, noticeable changes were evident. Tommy's sleep patterns had improved dramatically. His anxiety, while still present, was becoming more manageable. He was beginning to play without constantly seeking reassurance. He smiled more, genuine smiles, not the forced expressions of a child trying to please adults. Lisa Chen's journey was different but equally significant. She had lost custody of Tommy pending completion of a comprehensive rehabilitation program. She was required to attend weekly domestic violence counseling, where she confronted her own choices and the patterns that had led her to ignore warning signs of abuse. She attended parenting classes, where she learned about child development and appropriate responses to children's needs. She engaged in individual psychotherapy to address her own trauma history and the factors that had made her vulnerable to an abusive relationship. It was difficult, painful work. Lisa had to confront the reality that her love for Tommy, while genuine, had not been enough to protect him. She had to acknowledge that her fear of losing custody had been less important than Tommy's immediate safety. She had to rebuild her understanding of what it meant to be a responsible parent. After 6 months of consistent work, the court allowed supervised visitation. These visits were conducted in a neutral setting with a court-appointed monitor present. Lisa and Tommy would see each other for 2 hours, supervised to ensure Tommy's safety and to gather data about the quality of their interaction. The first visit was emotional, Tommy initially withdrawn, Lisa tearful with remorse and longing. But gradually, over subsequent visits, their relationship began to heal. Gregory Chen, Tommy's father, had been placed in an extremely difficult position. He had not known the full extent of Marcus's behavior and was himself dealing with guilt about not having protected his younger son. He underwent his own therapy and parenting education. His relationship with Sarah, his teenager, had been strained by the revelation of what had happened in their home, but therapy had helped them begin to rebuild that relationship with greater honesty and openness. Meanwhile, the criminal case against Marcus progressed through the judicial system. He was convicted of child abuse, assault, and inappropriate sexual contact with a minor. He was sentenced to 8 years in state prison, a sentence that reflected the severity of his crimes, while acknowledging that the most serious charges were difficult to prove beyond reasonable doubt given Tommy's age and inability to provide detailed testimony. The case attracted attention from child protection organizations, psychiatric professionals, and judicial reform advocates. Dr. Patricia Chen, the social worker, began publishing articles in professional journals about the intersection of animal behavior and child abuse detection. She proposed protocols for incorporating K9 behavioral observations into child protection assessments, arguing that dogs like Duke possessed perceptive abilities that could complement human investigative work. Judge Patricia Morrison, meanwhile, found herself at the center of an unexpected conversation about judicial protocol and the role of intuition in legal decision-making. Law schools began analyzing her decision to interrupt the trial. Some criticized it as highly irregular and potentially setting a dangerous precedent. Others praised it as an example of judicial wisdom that transcended rigid adherence to protocol. Morrison was invited to speak at judicial conferences, at law schools, and at child protection organizations. Her message was consistent. Justice is more than procedure. Sometimes doing what is right requires listening to wisdom that comes from unexpected sources. A dog perceived suffering that humans missed, and because I was willing to listen to that dog, a child was protected. Officer Marcus Chen found himself experiencing something unexpected fame. News outlets ran stories about the police dog who stopped a trial. Media organizations requested interviews. He was invited to speak at law enforcement conferences about the role of animal instinct in police work. Through it all, Chen remained humble, consistent in his messaging that the credit belonged to Duke, whose extraordinary perceptive abilities had made the outcome possible. But the most significant recognition came from within the police department. Duke was formally commended by the Philadelphia Police Commissioner. He received a medal at a public ceremony attended by city officials, social services representatives, and members of the press. Officer Chen stood beside his partner, his hand on Duke's collar, as the dog was publicly acknowledged for extraordinary service to the community. By the 1-year anniversary of that October day in the courthouse, Tommy had made remarkable progress. He was in kindergarten, his trauma still present but increasingly manageable through ongoing therapy. He was forming friendships with other children. He was sleeping through most nights. His behavioral indicators of abuse were diminishing, replaced by the natural resilience and joy of childhood. The court granted Margaret and Robert Williams permanent guardianship of Tommy, with the understanding that supervised visits with Lisa would continue, as she demonstrated her commitment to healing and changed behavior. Eventually, when Tommy was older and emotionally ready, he might be able to develop a relationship with his biological mother based on genuine safety and mutual respect. 18 months after that day, Lisa successfully completed all court-mandated programs. She secured stable employment, obtained her own apartment, and demonstrated genuine behavioral change. She was granted overnight visitation with Tommy, supervised initially but increasingly unsupervised as her stability continued. The case became a landmark in Pennsylvania's child protection system. Judge Morrison's decision to listen to Duke's instinct was studied in law schools. New protocols were developed for incorporating animal behavior observations into child welfare investigations. Other courts began asking whether they had been missing opportunities to protect vulnerable children by adhering too strictly to traditional investigative procedures. Duke, meanwhile, continued his work with the police department for 2 more years before retiring at age 14. His final years were spent with Officer Chen and his family, living a quiet life that belied his extraordinary legacy. When Duke passed away at age 16, his obituary appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer, describing him not just as a police dog, but as an animal who had changed the trajectory of a child's life and influenced judicial practice across the state. Years later, when Tommy was old enough to understand the full story, Officer Chen arranged for him to meet Duke during Duke's final months. Tommy, then 7 years old, sat beside the aging German shepherd, stroking his fur gently. "This is Duke," Officer Chen explained. "Duke is the reason you're safe today. Duke noticed that you were scared when no one else could see it. Duke told us you needed help." Tommy looked at the dog with wonder and understanding beyond his years. He understood, in the way that children sometimes do, that this remarkable animal had played a role in saving his life. Judge Morrison, upon her retirement 5 years after that October day, established a scholarship fund in Duke's name for students pursuing careers in child protection and animal-assisted therapy. Her statement at the fund's dedication captured the essence of what had occurred. Sometimes the most profound acts of justice come not from legal expertise or procedural knowledge, but from the willingness to listen to wisdom that exists beyond human understanding. A dog taught me that lesson. I hope this fund helps others learn it as well. The story of the police dog who stopped a trial became more than a news story. It became a parable about listening to the voiceless, about recognizing suffering that exists beneath the surface of normalcy, and about the extraordinary ways that justice can emerge when we're willing to step beyond our comfortable protocols and listen to truths that demand to be heard. And in a modest home in Philadelphia, a boy who had suffered unspeakable trauma in his earliest years grew into a resilient young man who understood, better than most, the fragility of childhood safety and the extraordinary power of compassion to heal what had been broken. The Philadelphia Department of Human Services moved with impressive urgency once Dr. Vasquez filed her comprehensive report. By 3:47 p.m., a caseworker named James Morrison, no relation to Judge Morrison, arrived at the courthouse with another social worker named Patricia Chen, also no relation to Officer Chen. They carried the weight of their profession, years of experience dealing with child abuse cases, domestic violence situations, and family trauma that existed beneath the surface of ordinary life. James Morrison was a tall man in his early 40s with salt and pepper hair and eyes that had witnessed too much human suffering, but retained their capacity for compassion. Patricia Chen was younger, in her early 30s, with an intensity of purpose that suggested she had entered social work specifically to protect vulnerable children from harm. Together, they represented the machinery of child protection, the institutional response that transforms discovery into action. They met with Dr. Vasquez in a private office to review the initial findings. The information was deeply troubling and painted a picture of systematic neglect and abuse. Tommy Chen, age 3, had displayed behavioral patterns consistent with child abuse, emotional trauma, anxiety, sleep disturbances that suggested nightmares, and signs of physical abuse including old bruising in various states of healing. Some bruises were yellowing, suggesting they were weeks old. Others were darker, indicating more recent trauma. Lisa Chen had admitted to months of deliberate denial, acknowledging that she had noticed Tommy's behavioral changes but had chosen not to take action due to her fear of losing custody. "The mother's culpability is significant," Patricia Chen said, reviewing her notes carefully. "She wasn't unaware. She witnessed the abuse. She saw behavioral changes in her son. She made a conscious choice not to intervene. That's not negligence, that's willful endangerment." James Morrison nodded grimly. "We need to act quickly. The child needs to be removed from the home immediately for his safety. The mother is complicit, regardless of her motivations. We'll need to establish emergency protective custody today before close of business." Patricia Chen was already typing on her tablet, initiating the emergency removal process. "I'm filing the emergency petition now. We can have a judge sign off on temporary custody removal within the hour. The child will go into emergency foster care pending the full investigation and any legal proceedings." The machinery of child protection, once activated, moved with determination that seemed almost military in its precision. Within 30 minutes, social services personnel were contacting a pre-approved list of emergency foster homes. Background checks were run with expedited priority. A foster family was identified, a couple named Robert and Margaret Williams who had been licensed foster parents for 8 years and had extensive experience with traumatized young children. Robert and Margaret Williams received the call at their home in Northeast Philadelphia. They had become accustomed to these emergency notifications. They represented the foundation of their chosen work. Margaret, a retired elementary school teacher with a gentle demeanor and infinite patience, immediately began preparing the spare bedroom. Robert, a retired construction worker with surprisingly gentle hands and a capacity for emotional attunement, began assembling age-appropriate toys and comfort items that might help a traumatized child feel less alone. "How old?" Margaret asked Robert as she changed the sheets on the small bed. 3 years old, Robert replied. "Male, history of abuse from mother's boyfriend, emotional and physical trauma indicators." Margaret's face reflected the sadness she always felt when learning about children suffering at the hands of adults, but her expression also hardened with resolve. "He'll be safe here. I'll make sure of that." Meanwhile, law enforcement was conducting their own investigation parallel to the Child Protective Services work. Police units were dispatched to locate Marcus, Lisa's boyfriend. They found him at an apartment 3 blocks from where the family lived, in a building that showed visible signs of neglect and decay. Marcus answered the door with the confidence of someone unaware that his actions had been discovered. "Marcus Williams?" the lead officer asked, though she already knew the answer from her briefing materials. "Yeah, that's me. What's this about?" His casual demeanor shifted only slightly when the officers identified themselves as police. A subtle wariness entered his expression, but not panic, the wariness of someone who had likely experienced law enforcement encounters before. "We have questions about your relationship with Lisa Chen and her son, Tommy Chen," the officer said carefully. "We're going to need you to come with us." The arrest was straightforward. Marcus didn't resist physically, though his expression shifted from confusion to anger to the dawning realization that his actions had been discovered. As he was placed in the patrol car, his facade of normalcy cracked, revealing the rage underneath. "This is bullshit," he shouted. "That kid was fine. His mother's overreacting." Back at the courthouse, Lisa sat in a small, windowless interview room with both social services representatives. The conversation was emotionally devastating for her. She was facing the immediate loss of custody of her son, the revelation that her maternal instincts had failed to protect him adequately, and the terrible knowledge that her own romantic choices had endangered the person she loved most. "I didn't know," she said repeatedly, her words becoming almost a mantra as her world collapsed around her. "I didn't know how bad it was. I thought as long as I was there, as long as I was watching, he would be safe." "But you knew something was wrong," Patricia Chen said gently but firmly, her professional compassion tempered by the hard reality of child protection. You knew Tommy was being rough-handled. You knew Marcus was being psychologically cruel. You knew there had been inappropriate touching, and you didn't take action. Lisa's hands trembled as she covered her face. I was scared. I was terrified. I was scared that if I reported it, if I did anything official, they would take Tommy away from me. I thought I was protecting him by staying, by being there, by hoping it would get better. I thought my presence would be enough to keep him safe. Instead, James Morrison said, his voice not unkind but absolutely clear and authoritative, you enabled an abusive situation to continue and escalate. A child is always the victim in these circumstances, and your fear of losing him was infinitely less important than his immediate safety. You made a choice, consciously or unconsciously, to prioritize your own interests over his welfare. The words were harsh, and they were also true. Lisa understood the logic even as her heart was breaking at the implications. She had rationalized her inaction as protection, when in reality it had been abandonment dressed up in the language of maternal love. By 5:30 p.m., Tommy had been placed in the protective custody of Robert and Margaret Williams. The transition was handled with as much gentleness as possible, though no amount of gentleness could eliminate the trauma of a 3-year-old being separated from his mother. A social worker accompanied Tommy to the Williams home, helping to explain in simple language that he would be staying with Robert and Margaret for a while, that he would be safe there, that people would help him feel better. Tommy cried inconsolably, reached for Lisa, called her name as Margaret Williams gently led him away. His small body was rigid with distress as his world, already fractured by abuse, shattered completely with separation from the only biological parent he knew. Lisa watched through tears streaming down her face, her own sobs echoing through the courthouse hallway, the weight of her failures pressing down on her with physical force that made her bend forward as if struck. Sarah, Tommy's 14-year-old sister, remained in the custody of her father Gregory, though she was now being counseled by court-appointed therapists to process the revelation that her family had been harboring abuse and that her younger brother had been suffering in ways she hadn't fully understood. The adolescent shock of discovering hidden family trauma, of realizing that her home had been a place of danger for her younger sibling, created its own form of psychological injury that would require healing. Gregory himself was devastated, not just by Tommy's situation, but by his own failure to protect his youngest son. As a parent, he carried guilt for not being more present, for not asking more probing questions when he noticed behavioral changes in Tommy, for allowing his ex-wife's romantic choices to supersede his protective responsibilities. Officer Chen and Duke observed much of this unfolding from a respectful distance in the courthouse. Chen had been given a thorough debriefing about Duke's behavior and the outcome that had resulted from the dog's extraordinary perception. Judge Morrison had personally thanked him, acknowledging that Duke had accomplished something remarkable that transcended the boundaries of normal law enforcement work. Your dog did what law enforcement, medical professionals, and family members failed to do, Morrison had said, her voice reflecting the gravity of what had occurred. He perceived suffering that existed beneath the surface of normal social interaction. He communicated that suffering in the only way available to him, through unwavering focus and behavioral intensity. And because you trusted your dog enough to bring him to court that day, and because I was willing to listen to what he was communicating, a child was protected. Chen had been deeply moved by the judge's words. He had always trusted Duke's instincts. It was the foundation of their partnership. But this was the first time those instincts had led to such profound human consequences. The dog had literally saved a child's life, not from immediate lethal danger, but from ongoing psychological and physical abuse that likely would have escalated and caused severe, potentially permanent trauma. The embezzlement trial that had been interrupted by Duke's behavior was now in an awkward legal position. Judge Morrison called a conference with both attorneys in her chambers to discuss how to proceed. The question of whether to continue or declare a mistrial was complex, with implications for both justice and legal precedent. "Gentlemen," Morrison said, settling behind her desk as both attorneys took seats, "we have an unprecedented situation. A trial that was well underway has been interrupted due to extraordinary circumstances. I'm aware that this interruption has created legal complications, and I understand that both of you may wish to raise procedural objections." David Hartwell, the defense attorney, leaned forward, his expression calculating. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this interruption has prejudiced my client significantly. The jury has been in recess for hours. The momentum of the prosecution's testimony has been disrupted. A mistrial may be the appropriate remedy, allowing for a retrial in the future under more stable circumstances." "Or," Sarah Mitchell countered forcefully, "we could simply resume proceedings tomorrow. The evidence is clear. The testimony is on the record. The jury can focus on the facts presented without the distraction of the interruption." Morrison raised her hand, her voice carrying unmistakable judicial authority. "Here's what I'm going to do. We will resume proceedings tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. The jury will be brought in and given clear instructions that the recess was a necessary judicial action unrelated to the merits of the case. We will allow the accounting expert to complete his testimony. The trial will proceed to completion. And if Mr. Hartwell wishes to appeal on procedural grounds afterward, he has every right to do so, and I welcome the appellate court's review of my decision." She paused, allowing her next words to carry maximum weight. "But I want both of you to understand something. A 3-year-old child was protected today because I made the decision to listen to something beyond the normal parameters of judicial procedure. That child was removed from an abusive situation that had already caused documented psychological trauma and physical injury. If that child had not been removed from his dangerous environment, the consequences could have been catastrophic, escalating abuse, permanent psychological damage, or worse." She looked directly at both attorneys. "The trial of Robert Sullivan will continue. Justice will be pursued on that front. But the greater justice that occurred today, the protection of an innocent child from ongoing abuse, that was more important than any embezzlement case, no matter how significant the financial amounts involved. Sometimes doing what is right means stepping beyond the comfortable boundaries of procedure. This was one of those times." Hartwell had no response. Even he, cynical as he was about the legal system, understood the magnitude of what had occurred. The judge had made a decision that transcended legal protocol, and she was willing to accept whatever consequences that decision might generate on appeal. The months following that extraordinary day in October unfolded with the slow, methodical pace of healing and justice that characterizes legal and therapeutic intervention. The embezzlement trial resumed the following morning, and despite the dramatic interruption, the jury maintained focus on the evidence presented. Robert Sullivan was convicted on all counts: embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, a sentence that reflected the severity of his crimes and the profound impact he had on hundreds of victims whose life savings had evaporated through his calculated deception. But strangely, the trial that had been interrupted by Duke's extraordinary behavior seemed almost secondary to what had truly mattered that October day: the protection of a vulnerable child. Tommy Chen's journey toward healing began immediately upon his placement with Robert and Margaret Williams. The foster parents were experienced in working with traumatized children, understanding with hard-won wisdom that recovery from abuse required patience, consistency, and unconditional support. They established routines that provided both structure and safety, regular meal times that created predictability, bedtimes with gentle rituals that helped Tommy feel secure, playtime with age-appropriate toys that allowed expression without words, and constant reassurance that he was loved and protected. The first month was the most difficult. Tommy experienced nightmares that would wake him crying, his small body drenched in sweat, calling for his mother even though his conscious mind understood that he wasn't safe with her. He had regressive behaviors, returning to thumb sucking after he'd been past that developmental stage, difficulty with toilet training that he had previously mastered, and a clinginess that meant he needed to know Margaret's location at all times. He would follow her from room to room, panicking if she closed a door between them. He flinched at sudden movements and loud voices, his nervous system still in survival mode, still processing the threat that had been his daily reality. Loud noises would trigger fear responses that seemed disproportionate to a 3-year-old child. Raised voices between Margaret and Robert, even gentle disagreements that normal families experience, would cause Tommy to withdraw into himself, expecting punishment or violence. But Margaret Williams was patient in ways that only years of experience and genuine love could provide. She held Tommy through his nightmares, whispering soft reassurances while he cried for his mother. She sang to him softly when he was anxious, her voice becoming an anchor to safety. She demonstrated through consistent action, day after day, that the world could be safe, that adults could be trustworthy, that love didn't have to come with pain or fear or the threat of violence. Robert Williams taught Tommy simple things that carried profound meaning. He taught him how to throw a ball without the aggressive force that Marcus had used. He showed him how to help water the garden, giving Tommy a sense of purpose and accomplishment. He taught him how to feel pride in small accomplishments, watering the plants correctly, helping feed the dog, picking up his toys. These simple activities, performed without criticism or anger, began to rebuild Tommy's understanding of what interactions with adults could be. A court-appointed psychologist, Dr. Michael Torres, began seeing Tommy twice weekly for therapeutic sessions. The sessions with a 3-year-old were necessarily different from traditional therapy. They couldn't rely on verbal processing that required sophistication beyond his developmental stage. Instead, they involved play, drawing, sensory activities, and careful observation of behavioral patterns. Through these sessions, Tommy began to reveal his trauma through his play. He acted out scenarios with dolls that depicted yelling, hitting, and fear, scenes that were obviously drawn from his lived experience. But gradually, with Dr. Torres' gentle guidance and therapeutic interventions, Tommy began to act out scenarios where the threatening figure was removed, where safety was restored, where the child figure was comforted and protected. His play became less frantic, less repetitive. He began to incorporate other themes beyond trauma, playing house, playing with animals, playing games that had nothing to do with abuse or fear. By month 3, noticeable changes were evident to everyone in Tommy's life. His sleep patterns had improved dramatically. He was sleeping through more nights, waking with fewer nightmares. His anxiety, while still present and occasionally surfacing unexpectedly, was becoming more manageable. He was beginning to play with toys without constantly seeking reassurance that Margaret was nearby. He smiled more, genuine smiles that transformed his face, not the forced expressions of a child trying to please adults or avoid punishment. Lisa Chen's journey was different but equally significant in its own way. She had lost custody of Tommy pending completion of a comprehensive rehabilitation program that the court had mandated. She was required to attend weekly domestic violence counseling, where she confronted her own choices and the patterns that had led her to ignore warning signs of abuse. A trained domestic violence counselor helped Lisa understand the psychological mechanisms that had allowed her to rationalize her inaction, the fear of loss, the minimization of danger, the hope that things would improve without intervention. She attended parenting classes where she learned about child development, age-appropriate expectations, and appropriate responses to children's needs. She came face to face with the reality that a 3-year-old cannot regulate emotions, cannot understand abstract concepts, and requires consistent protection and appropriate discipline from adults. She learned that her presence, without intervention, was not protection, it was complicity. She engaged in individual psychotherapy to address her own trauma history. She had grown up in a home with her own mother's boyfriend who had been abusive. She explored the patterns that had made her vulnerable to an abusive relationship with Marcus, the way her own childhood trauma had created vulnerabilities that he had exploited. She began to understand how generational trauma and maladaptive coping mechanisms had created a dangerous cycle. It was difficult, painful work that required her to confront uncomfortable truths about herself. Lisa had to acknowledge that her love for Tommy, while genuine and powerful, had not been enough to protect him. She had to accept that her fear of losing custody had been less important than Tommy's immediate safety. She had to rebuild her understanding of what it meant to be a responsible parent, not just a parent who loved, but a parent who protected, who intervened, who was willing to take action even when it was difficult. After 6 months of consistent work, attending all required counseling sessions, completing the parenting classes, and demonstrating genuine behavioral change, the court allowed supervised visitation. These visits were conducted in a neutral setting with a court-appointed monitor present, not to accuse or judge, but to ensure Tommy's safety and to gather data about the quality of their interaction and whether Lisa was maintaining appropriate boundaries. The first visit was emotionally charged. Tommy, who had not seen his biological mother in 6 months, initially withdrew. He clung to Margaret Williams, who remained in the room during the supervised visit. Lisa was tearful with remorse and longing, struggling to contain her emotions while also respecting Tommy's need for safety and space. But gradually, over subsequent visits conducted bi-weekly, their relationship began to heal. Tommy would eventually sit near his mother, allowing her to read to him from children's books. Lisa learned to follow Tommy's lead rather than overwhelming him with her own need for connection. She began to understand that her role now was not to demand his love or forgiveness, but to demonstrate through consistent, appropriate behavior that she was different, that she had changed. Gregory Chen, Tommy's father, had been placed in an extremely difficult position that carried its own psychological weight. He had not known the full extent of Marcus's behavior and was tormented by guilt about not having protected his younger son more vigilantly. As a parent who shared custody with Lisa, he carried responsibility for failing to notice or intervene despite the warning signs that he later recognized. He underwent his own therapy, individual counseling that helped him process his guilt, his role in the family dynamics, and his own patterns of denial and minimization. He attended parenting education classes alongside other divorced and separated parents seeking to improve their relationships with their children. His relationship with Sarah, his teenager, had been strained by the revelation of what had happened in their home, but therapy had helped them begin to rebuild that relationship with greater honesty and openness. Sarah herself had entered therapy to process the trauma of learning that her younger brother had been abused in her home, a space she had considered safe. She struggled with guilt about not having noticed, with anger at both her parents for the family dysfunction, and with the responsibility of being an older sibling to a child who had suffered profound trauma. Meanwhile, the criminal case against Marcus progressed through the judicial system with methodical determination. He was convicted of child abuse, assault on a minor, and inappropriate sexual contact with a minor, charges that carried serious penalties under Pennsylvania law. He was sentenced to 8 years in state prison, a sentence that reflected the severity of his crimes, while acknowledging that the most serious charges were difficult to prove beyond reasonable doubt given Tommy's age and inability to provide detailed testimony. The case attracted significant attention from child protection organizations, psychiatric professionals, and judicial reform advocates. The unusual nature of the case, a trial interrupted because of a dog's behavior that led to the discovery and intervention of child abuse, captured the imagination of media outlets and professional communities. Dr. Patricia Chen, the social worker, began publishing articles in professional journals about the intersection of animal behavior and child abuse detection. She proposed protocols for incorporating K9 behavioral observations into child protection assessments, arguing that dogs like Duke possessed perceptive abilities that could complement human investigative work. Her articles generated discussion in social work circles about expanding how professionals approach child protection investigations. Judge Patricia Morrison, meanwhile, found herself at the center of an unexpected conversation about judicial protocol and the role of intuition in legal decision-making. Law schools began analyzing her decision to interrupt the trial. Some criticized it as highly irregular and potentially setting a dangerous precedent that could undermine the stability of judicial proceedings. Others praised it as an example of judicial wisdom that transcended rigid adherence to protocol, a recognition that justice sometimes required flexibility and the willingness to listen to wisdom from unexpected sources. Morrison was invited to speak at judicial conferences, at law schools, and at child protection organizations. Her message was consistent and powerful. Justice is more than procedure. Justice is more than following rules and protocols without question. Sometimes doing what is right requires listening to wisdom that comes from unexpected sources. A dog perceived suffering that humans missed. And because I was willing to listen to that dog, a child was protected from ongoing abuse. That matters more than any trial interruption or procedural irregularity. Officer Marcus Chen found himself experiencing something unexpected, a form of public recognition that was both gratifying and somewhat overwhelming. News outlets ran stories about the police dog who stopped a trial and the German Shepherd who saved a child's life. Media organizations requested interviews. He was invited to speak at law enforcement conferences about the role of animal instinct in police work. Through it all, Chen remained humble and grounded, consistent in his messaging that the credit belonged to Duke, whose extraordinary perceptive abilities had made the outcome possible. He emphasized that Duke's behavior was not a trained response, but an instinctive recognition of human suffering, a reminder that sometimes the wisdom of animals exceeded human perception. But the most significant recognition came from within the police department itself. Duke was formally commended by the Philadelphia Police Commissioner in a public ceremony. He received a medal that was placed on his collar, an honor typically reserved for officers who had performed extraordinary service. Officer Chen stood beside his partner, his hand on Duke's collar, as the dog was publicly acknowledged for extraordinary service to the community, service that had extended far beyond his traditional role in crime detection.